Greetings, Poe fans. Welcome to another edition of Poe Unplugged. I am Carmen Bolden.
And I am Jeanie Smith, and we are
The Poetastic Two.
Come zoom with us into the Unbook Club dedicated to the works of Mr. Edgar Allan Poe.
Welcome back, everybody, to our Poe Unplugged, where tonight we're going to look at King Pest. And so Jeanie is going to start this discussion this week. We talked beforehand, and I'm like, Jeanie, you got this one.
Yeah, I think that's just the underlying jab at me about being the King Pest thing. But I'm just going to say that no, I'm not. But no, I think one of the reasons that I would like to take over starting all this off is the premise that we've discovered through many academics that have talked about it, that Edgar Allan Poe meant the King Pest towards Andrew Jackson during the time period that he wrote this. So that's why, thankfully, we have with us tonight Miss Erin. I can't remember your last name, Erin. Sorry.
Adams. That's okay.
Thank you. You'd think I'd remember that. Erin
I know,
Adams.
presidential. Hello, Jeanie.
Yeah, I know. I mean, but she works at the Hermitage. That's Jackson, not Adams.
I know.
But yeah, Erin Adams is going to join us here. She actually is the educational director. Is that correct? Yeah. Educational director at the Hermitage here in Nashville. So she's going to help us understand from the historical side and the Jackson side and all that wonderful side, and how we tie it all in with King Pest.
Yes.
So we want to start off with, first of all, how many was this the first time anybody had read King Pest? Anybody? This was the first reading?
Me.
Okay. So we got Keith, we got Will, all those. So for
Jeff,
those,
Jeff.
Yeah, Dr. Jeff, sorry. So anybody want to jump in here and tell us your just overall feeling of the writing itself? Go forth. Who would like to say something?
Virginia's thinking. Oh, go ahead, Keith.
I really, honestly, I read it twice, because the first time I went through it, I'm like, what? And then the second time, I mean, I like his work and everything, but this was just kind of disturbing in a way to me. I mean, honestly, I felt sorry for the two sailors at the end of the story. I mean, even though they were up to something bad at the beginning on what they were planning to do, it was just like, oh, I was like, okay, well, this kind of goes along the line with other things that he has written. But I just, maybe it's just me. I really wasn't as fond of this one as I have been of his other work.
Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, I will agree with you wholeheartedly, because the only thing that kept me thinking that this was an Edgar Allan Poe story was the similarities to the two particular seamen at the beginning and throughout, because I kept going back to the Cask of Amontillado.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they reminded me of the characters being led down into the catacombs kind of thing, where they weren't really, doing anything, specifically bad. But yes, they were doing things illegal at the time. But at the end, they become kind of, I guess, not really heroes, but they get themselves out of trouble. And then Will in the chat says the grotesque character is supposed to represent greedy people in power, popular, infamous at the time. Andrew Jackson is the one I know. So yeah, we're going to talk more about that, Will, because specifically it's one of the reasons why we wanted to bring on Erin here to help us talk a little bit about the heritage of the Hermitage and Andrew Jackson. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Erin so she can just give us a little background about what she does, everything at the Hermitage, and then we'll get back into King Pest.
Yes.
Yeah, King Pest, this is not the first time I read King Pest. The first time I read it, it's been several years ago now, maybe the fall of 2016, but we had We've gotten in the habit over the last several years of bringing in living historians who portray Poe and Irving and Dickens and others to do a performance, of their famous person's work. And so Rob Villella, who is no longer portraying as Poe, but Google him because the guy looks exactly like Villella, and he looks exactly like Poe, and he's done just terrific work.
He's great. I got to see him. Yes, at the Hermitage. Yes, he was so good.
Yeah, he really was. And he had done quite a lot of really in-depth study in Poe and in Poe's inspirations for writing. So one of the stories he mentioned, I remember, was King Pest, and I'd never heard of it before, but he set it up as an allegory about Jackson's economic policies. And I read it at the time, and I remember thinking, like, what have I just read? I'm not getting economic allegory out of this. Like, is it just real obvious to everybody else, and I'm missing it somehow? So the answer partly to that was yes, but so it had been a while since I'd gotten back to rereading it, and so it was good to have the exercise. So a little bit about me, though, before I get in there. I'm the director of education at Andrew Jackson's Hermitage. I've been there for about 10 years now. I typically oversee the K-12 education that we do. So we serve about, depending on how you count, we serve about 35,000 school-age children a year. We also do the lifelong learning program. So we have a book club, for example. Ours will be next Tuesday night. And so we do that. We do a youth leadership camp in the summer, lots of different intergenerational programming. I wrote the audio tour that we're currently using on site. So we're just involved in a lot of different things. Our department also oversees the guest services staff. And so sort of your standard daily visit to the Hermitage is going to fall under my department somewhere. And so that's primarily what my folks are involved in. But my undergraduate degrees are in English and in history. So I always love it when literature gets to cross, when they really get to walk hand in hand like this. So a little bit about Jackson, then kind of at the time of this writing. So this is written in 1835. By 1835, Jackson is now down to the last 2 years of his time in office. He first took office in 1829, leaves office in 1837, and by September of 1835, in the fall of that year, I mean, look at the list of things that have already been accomplished in Jackson's time, for good or bad. But the Indian Removal Act has been passed. That passes in 1830. By 1835, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw have already been forcibly removed from their homelands, or are going now at a rate voluntarily that satisfies the nation's objectives. Jackson has just signed off on the Treaty of New Echota, which is what governs the Cherokee forced removal. Jackson has also fought a pretty heavy-handed war against Nicholas Biddle and the powers of the Bank of the United States that is going to end up resulting in one of the worst depressions that we have in the United States, and that's the Panic of 1837. Jackson has also had to deal with the nullification crisis, which is South Carolina threatening to nullify federal law and secede. Now, South Carolina is threatening nullification because of the way that tariffs are being imposed on imports and exports. The state of South Carolina ends up footing y'all something like 2/3 of the nation's entire tax bill. And Jackson has really had to kind of keep his thumb down on South Carolina in order to just keep them paying their taxes because he's using that money to pay the national debt. So we are out of debt as a nation by 1835, by the late summer of 1835, the only time, and that debt freedom holds until Jackson is out of office. So Jackson has already had quite a robust and tempestuous presidency. And all of this, of course, is governed largely in the public eye by his personality. Jackson is incredibly gifted intellectually, but he is gifted enough in that intellectual capacity to know that his personality and his kind of fiery spirit are seen as weaknesses, but they're also seen as strengths in some quarters. So Jackson has very much mastered the art of when to use that and when not to. So at this point, people sort of see Jackson. You either still love the guy or you hate the guy. But they certainly still see Jackson as relevant. They see him as incredibly powerful. His influence reaches very, very far. He has a very long reach. In fact, I was studying up on a couple of articles talking about linking Poe King Pest and Jackson. And so one of the things they mention over and over again is that either you were a Jacksonian Democrat or you were an anti-Jacksonian Whig. And I love how they set that up, because we have examples in the collection of ballot ticketing, election tickets, like delegates of the state legislatures to the various political like Democratic conferences and stuff like that. And the ticket doesn't say, I'm voting for the Democrats or I'm voting for the Whigs. They say I'm voting for the Jacksonians or the anti-Jacksonians. Like Jackson often gets a lot of credit for ushering in like the two-party system. And he's not totally the one who ushers it in, but that is now strengthening very, very much under Jackson's presidency. But those two parties aren't the Democrats and a legitimate it is a legitimate public party, political party, but the name of that party is not the Democrat and the Whig or the Democrat and the Federalist or the Democrat and the Republican. It is the Jacksonians and the anti-Jacksonians. So you really are running for Jackson, or you're voting for Jackson, or you're voting not for Jackson. So that is the very powerful reach that Jackson has, and kind of the power that he wields, if you will, over American thought at the time. You're either a Jacksonian or an anti-Jacksonian, and that's going to trickle out beyond politics. It's going to be in the arts. It's going to be in economics. It's going to be, in how you view the future of the nation, right? So either you're a Jacksonian or you're an anti-Jacksonian.
Exactly. And I think, especially in King Pest, you get that. To me, you get that understanding with the two characters of the seamen versus the pests, and it's like a total shift. It's like they get invited in to talk about, but the pests are so contrived as grotesque, but at the same time, and they have identifying markers that can go along with what was going on in the Jacksonian times. Like you were saying about the treaty being passed, and the him wielding one of the things, and I sent this to Carmen earlier when we were talking, because one of the things that when I taught before I had to retire, I always taught 8th grade American history. So Jacksonian democracy was a whole big unit that I had to teach, and one of those was political cartoons that came out of it. And Jackson was all about those political cartoons. So it was very much, when I was reading it, I could see, as you were talking, I automatically started identifying each one of those pests with certain characteristics, I guess you'd say, with the way Poe has them listed, especially the king pest. And because it talks about how he has a crown. How is it exactly how he words it?
He
king
talks about,
go ahead.
He talks about how he's got that like unnaturally large forehead.
Right.
This prominent and unnaturally large forehead, that his that on top of his head are these sable plumes.
Yes.
So a very exaggerated perception of a period undertaker. It almost sounds more Dickensian. Like I feel like I'm seeing Jackson presented as an exaggerated character out of Dickens. Like Fagin comes to mind for some reason from Oliver Twist. I know it's not exactly the same, but that's just kind of the picture that I have in mind. So you have this like, just as like Fagin is this highly corrupt and corruptible character, like Jackson wields that same power. Like Fagin is very much corrupting the Artful Dodger and Twist and all of these other young and innocent men, and Jackson is sort of cast in that same vein in this way. So yeah, the when you get introduced in the story to the grotesque figures, immediately, like, they call him Mr. President. They don't refer to him as Your Majesty or the King. They're calling him
Right.
Mr. President, or at least his fellow grotesques are referring to him as Mr. President. I
Yeah.
love, though, the reference to St. Andrew
Yes.
Stairs, and it's those stairs that get legs and tarpaulin into, like, that broken down, prohibited, desolate, disease-ridden part of town that they are not supposed to be in, but it's St. Andrew who gets them there, right? But then they meet Mr. President. So the various features, his characterization of the young woman, the very small, slight woman who has a leaden, he says she has this leaden skin, but then she has these spots of lividity. So she's got like a very hectically flushed sort of temperament, like she has the galloping consumption. So this is Jackson's niece, Emily Tennessee Donaldson, who has been who's been serving as the hostess of the White House since Rachel Jackson, Jackson's wife, is deceased at this point. So, and she does have the galloping consumption. I mean, she dies by 1836, and she's very young. She's in her 20s, her young 20s. I mean, like 26, 27. She's had several children while at the White House, right? But here she is dying of this galloping consumption. Which made me a little sad. I really have a lot of respect for Emily Donaldson in many ways. And Emily Donaldson is about the only woman besides Jackson's wife that is able to sort of corral him and kind of occasionally offer Jackson advice that he will listen to. There's not many other women who have that power except for his wife, Rachel, and Emily's about the closest that anybody else gets to it. There's a figure in there, though, and I think it's the one that he describes as wearing that coat of such garrulous colors, like it's just very bright and it's almost gaudy. And you mentioned political cartoons, Jeannie. There is, of course, many political cartoons made of Jackson during this period, and they are a delight. And kids, students, when I do this with students, and I say, oh, we're going to look at some political cartoons, they think they're going to be those funny, short, Peanuts or the Family Circle, the Family Circus, right? Just these little quippy, short, obvious punchline, kind of comics. They don't understand cartoon as an art form rather than just the humor, than as a work of humor. So just the depth of detail that these political cartoons of this period pull on. I mean, Jackson is queuing it up for them, right? I mean, Jackson's just constantly giving them plenty of material to work with. But there is a figure in the political cartoons named Major Jack Dowling. And Major Dowling is proposed, I noticed, by a couple of scholars as being the character on whom that brightly garrulous coat wearing member of the grotesque party is based. And Major Jack Dowling is not a real person. He is a character. He's sort of the everyman character, if you will, that shows up in a lot of Jackson's cartoons. So Major Dowling is meant to be this character that represents the common man of the United States, the people of the United States. And so Dowling is often used in cartoons as a way of showing where the public stands, just kind of where the common man stands on any of these various issues. So one of my favorite of the cartoons is related to the Bank War, and it's General Jackson fights the many-headed monster is the name of it. It's the Hydra. And so there's Jackson is like wailing away at this Hydra with his cane, and he's got the big forehead and the hair standing straight up. And he has only two assistants in this. One is Martin Van Buren, who's kind of off to the side, and he's holding like Nicholas Biddle's head in place so Jackson can take a good whack at it. But then Major Jack Dowling is standing at the back, but he's kind of like ready to duck, dodge, dip, and dive, and catch whatever else is coming his way.
That's okay.
Everybody meets up then. So I love the characters that are playing a role in the grotesque. One of the other characters is suggested to be Peggy O'Neill Eaton, who was the wife of Jackson's Secretary of War, John Eaton. John Eaton is a Tennessean. He meets Margaret O'Neill, who is a boarding house owner, basically in Washington, a hotelier. And her, not long after she meets Eaton, there's these rumors going around that they're having an affair. All of a sudden, Mr. O'Neill dies under fairly questionable circumstances. It seems like suicide is kind of the accepted option, but it's not for sure. And so people have plenty of complaints about Peggy O'Neill, right? That she is just this, she's driven her husband to the brink of suicide, because in less than, it's really just a couple of months, and now all of a sudden she's married to John Eaton, who's a member of Jackson's cabinet. Right. And Peggy Eaton, when you look at her portraits, is not your standard kind of typical society matron, svelte, lovely. She's not a Dolly Madison, who looks like a woman and speaks with authority, but has some grace and some dignity. She's not an Emily Donaldson who's just young and, young and light spirited and kind of this fresh energy in Washington. She's Peggy O'Neill, and that comes with a lot of baggage.
Yeah.
So she's a woman who, Jackson takes up the cause of the Eatons when they're being essentially, disfellowshipped by every person who's standing in Washington, especially the cabinet members and their wives. And Jackson takes their side instead of taking his own niece's side, which is to just pass over John Eaton for somebody less problematic, with a less problematic wife, somebody who can help restore some of that dignity to the White House and to the cabinet. And he just won't hear of it. He won't have it. And so he is determined to fight Peggy Eaton's fights for her, but in a way that eventually causes almost the entirety of the cabinet to resign. So she is a woman who brings a lot of upheaval with her. So that combination of Jacksonian characters as the grotesques, I find to be a really interesting assemblage of people.
Yeah.
There are plenty of people within Jackson's circle that have some questionable behaviors and characters, but the way that Poe brings these people together, he really brings those people into this group that can have, that an artist is sort of looking for. You know what I mean? Like that, whether they're an artist of language or a visual artist, like these are the people you can do something with.
Yeah.
So I find that what Poe is doing by making them the grotesques is really it's a really interesting take on that. And Will, I noticed your comment from a little earlier about are the grotesque characters supposed to represent greedy people in power? So they are meant to represent very specific people in seats of power that are popular and infamous in their way. So absolutely, yeah. The only one that's sort of a stock character, if you will, is Major Jack Dowling. But all the rest of them, it's a matter of interpretation. I don't think of Emily Donaldson, for example, as a greedy person. She's a 21-year-old girl whose uncle is the president of the United States and her husband is his chief of staff. So she is there to run the White House. That's, somebody's got to do it, and that's her job.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think about her so much as the greedy one. But certainly with like Peggy O'Neill, Peggy Eaton, like that would absolutely be part of the discussion with Peggy.
Yeah, and it also, to me, it represented a lot of kind of the take on the spoils system that they were accusing Jackson of and all of that. I don't know the exact cliche quote. I can't remember. To the winners to the winners go the spoils or something like that.
Right.
But anyway, so yeah, that would be, because in my mind, and this is the one thing that I found the most interesting about this particular Poe work, is he spent so much time building the visual I mean, he's really good at building visuals, but it's like he gave extra to these particular characters to where you could literally draw them in your mind.
Yeah.
Because when he was describing King Pest, all I could see was that political cartoon of Jackson as a king. And I can't share it because I don't have sharing
Well,
things, but I
Jeannie, I've got it. I went ahead while you guys were talking and brought it up. So hold on a second and let me see if I can. Give me just a second. My
Now, the one
screen
thing I
here.
thought was interesting was the skeleton hanging from the ceiling with his one arm straight out, but his his skull was empty except for what was lighting everything. So it was like, huh, was that supposed to be like the light bulb moment and the dude like fried and you can't, he had one good idea and that's all he was allowed is kind of what I was thinking. So,
All right,
but
can you
it was
guys see that?
yeah,
Oh, I love
yeah,
that so much.
yeah. This is the one that when I saw the picture, I read it and I saw this picture because you have like he even has in the story how King Pest is sitting there and he's got what is it he says that he's got in his right hand.
Well, he's
But
got
all
a
I could
thigh bone as like his
He's got
yeah,
a
scepter.
he's
femur.
got a thigh
Yeah.
bone like a sepulcher. And
Yeah.
I saw this and I immediately was like, oh, yeah, because he has a sepulcher in his right hand in this particular cartoon. And then the crown, you can't really see it with the open with whatever on top of
Yeah,
it.
hold on. Let me see if I can get rid of that. No, it's not gonna let me.
Just hit the plus button down there and it'll should zoom it in.
Yeah, but I've got to bring it down. There we
Yeah.
go. There we go.
Good.
Yeah. See, and that right there, that crown is exactly what I was envisioning when I was reading the story.
Yeah.
And I was like, I wonder if he included this because if I'm not mistaken, this particular political cartoon was published around the same time as he published King Pest.
Yeah, this should not have been too much of this. I think Poe would have. I think Poe has got the kind of artistic vision that was seized on this image very, very quickly and very
Yes.
strongly. Yeah, absolutely. And
And
I was gonna. Oh, I'm sorry, Jeannie.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, no, you were talking about some of the different. No, you go ahead, please. You were talking about some of the different elements of the image, and I just had a brainstorm about one, but you might be about to say it. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to bring up how under this political cartoon it has King Andrew the First, and he always kept referring to King Pest the First,
Yeah.
born to
Mhm.
command. But underneath there, he's got a king who possessing as much power as the gracious William the Fourth, and placed himself. And he gives description on this political cartoon that kind of matches with who the grotesque party is that Jackson has at his at his table. And so I don't know where you were going to talk about Erin, but I was just going to say that King Pest was definitely Andrew Jackson in my opinion, and then the coffin, the character with the coffin, I was like, that's unusual. His arms are out, and he's not really laying down, he's not sitting up, and it's like,
Yeah.
that's just odd. But okay. So
Yeah.
you say what you were going to, Erin, and
Yeah,
then
I was just going to mention in the cartoon. Can you pull the cartoon up again,
Yeah.
Carmen?
Yeah. Hold on one second.
So okay, so you know how when they talk about when they're describing King Pest, he talks about he's sitting with a femur, a thigh bone in his hand. You'll notice in the cartoon here that what Jackson has in his hand is the veto power, right?
Yeah.
So what is where he's got the scepter, but he's got the femur, and the veto power is, I mean, and this is mentioned in several places, but what really gives people the idea that Jackson is about to turn into this monarchical, dictator, One, it did not help that he had the military background, right? That crushing victory over the British at New Orleans. It does not help that people have seen him victorious on the battlefield, and they think that, that Napoleon has somehow set the model for Jackson. And so, of course, Jackson's going to act the way Napoleon did, because that's what you do when you're that kind of general. But what people really are afraid of is that veto power, because the way Jackson is using it, this is sort of a trend throughout Jackson's life, and definitely during the presidency. But Jackson always, I can't tell if he makes this happen or if he just sort of ends up being the guy who's always there when it happens. But there are so many constitutional principles of the powers of the executive branch that are simply untested, right? And so, we think about the founding fathers being these very wise and studious and intentional planners, and they were. But you can plan all day, and then when the time comes to actually roll into motion, some of the plans you've put in place, all of a sudden you begin to see the flaws in those plans in a way that you didn't before, when it hadn't been tested out. So here is Jackson exercising the veto, which the Constitution allows, but he's exercising it in a way that they've never seen before. And so when I think of this thigh bone in his hand, I mean, a femur is the largest and like the strongest bone in the human body. I mean, you could bludgeon somebody with a thigh bone, and what they're feeling like is that Jackson is bludgeoning them with the veto threat. The bank, arguably, I think the most important veto in American history is when Jackson vetoes the charter of the Second Bank of the United States, because he tells them, like, I'm not going to veto bills just from administrative principles. So Jackson's predecessors had very much dealt with the veto as if it was an administrative tool with a flaw that was going to lead to more confusion than help, and maybe the logistics of it weren't going to be so easy. So they would veto it under those circumstances, send it back to Congress, tell Congress to keep working on it, and Congress would send it back and they'd approve it. So the vetoes were more about almost like a proofreading tool, if you will, until Jackson comes along, and Jackson says, I'm not going to be using the veto this way. I'm going to veto something if I feel like either it violates the Constitution or it does not serve the broad citizenry to the best of its ability, right? So Jackson signs a veto 12 times, and an eyebrow raising, hair raising, hackles raising 12 times in his entire 8 years in office. And, I always set that against like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who signs a veto more than 300 times in his presidency. So, it's that bludgeoning power of the veto that Jackson is holding on them to. And then, of course, I love that he is standing on the documents. Of course, one is the Constitution. So, of course, he's just ripped up the Constitution altogether. We're going to be a monarchy now, right? That's what this image suggests. But the other document that's underneath Jackson's feet is a statement about internal improvements in the nation, which is essentially code for infrastructure, right? Right. Canals, waterway improvement, railroads, all of this is burgeoning technology under Jackson's time. And Jackson has very strong feelings about what the government should and should not be involved with when it comes to internal improvements in the country. So there are things that he approves them to do, things that he dissuades them from doing. And so I'm thinking about St. Andrew's Stair, which leads them to, again, this really, impoverished, beat down, disease-ridden, crime-infested neighborhood, right? And I think these are St. Andrew's Stairs, right? Is this desire to turn over the internal improvements of the nation to the state governments, to the local governments, that is not an affair for the federal government to take on. So I love that. And all of these are brainstorms, by the way, because I'm sort of looking at this image in a new light. But I hadn't thought too much about that being the internal improvements document down there. And now all of a sudden I'm kind of thinking of it a little bit differently.
Yeah, that makes sense. It definitely does.
And that's one of the things about the National Bank that was Alexander Hamilton's baby. Was the idea of having a federal bank, because that's how we had the first bank was Alexander Hamilton. and then like you were talking about, the infrastructure of trying to coordinate by getting roads built, by train tracks, all that kind of stuff was happening, and Jackson very much was like, that should be handled by the states. I don't, the government shouldn't do that. That's just too much. So when I'm thinking of it in Poe's story, and like you said about the St. Andrew Stairs, and about going into this pestilent ridden part of town, and they end up going into this creepy, because I love how Poe actually gets the two seamen to go into this areas, because they hear someone laughing inside. And so that's why they go in there. Plus they're escaping from, somebody chasing them because they ran out on their bill. So they're the first dine and dashers. Or would that be pub crawlers and leavers? But so when they go in there, I love how he makes a point of being very specific about certain things. The femur bone, yes, beating people over the head. And like you said, he used that veto power on the second bank to the point to where it got to where they couldn't overpower his veto because they couldn't get enough votes. The Senate did not have enough votes.
Right. Jackson didn't have Jackson let it be known there is no way you can go back and rewrite this bill that I'll approve it. Like, I'm going to say no on principle, And so like, how are you, Jackson just shuts down any possibility for compromise in that way because he objects to the bank on constitutional footing. It has to do with the way in which Congress is delegating their authority to somebody that has not been vetted by the people of the United States. So, so who are, I think a cat knocked something over. So, who are, where's this if there was an argument that was going to sway Jackson, where in the world would it have come from? I just can't even envision what that was. So Jackson has let them know, you can't possibly bring me this bill in any form, in any way that I'm going to approve of it. So you might as well just stop trying, and it's pretty overwhelming. I had a student once ask me if Jackson ever had a most stressful year. And I loved that question. I loved the way that the student put it and kind of their insights to it. And I thought about it for a second, and I said, it's 1832 because he's running for re-election. He's got the bank to deal with, and he vetoes the bank it's July and the re-election's in November. And he's got South Carolina to deal with, threatening to secede, and that's all in a re-election cycle. So 1832 was rough. It was real rough for Jackson, I think. And I think
it was a bad time.
You see so many threads of that in this story, which is really interesting to me.
Yeah. And I like the setting that, it's in Will Wimble, the Undertaker's, like the basement, the apartment is it's the basement of where the Undertaker lives. And so it just adds that, extra creepiness to the whole situation. And with Poe describing, the skeletal remains, and also, some, I think, what did he say? Some flesh torn off, some bodies, and, with the plague being present and just all the pestilence, existing. One of the articles I looked at comparing the two was they kind of, the person that wrote the article kind of perused that this was the precursor to the Masque of the Red Death, because this was published in 1835. Masque of the Red Death was 1842. And it's like, Poe could have kind of thought of some of those elements to put into Masque of the Red Death. I personally think this story could have been fleshed out even longer than it was, and more depth given to, because there were so many characters, which Poe normally doesn't have this many. It's like, this would be an interesting play, in my opinion, if this was a play. I don't know. What thoughts, anybody?
I like how you're talking about it could have been longer, but at the same time, to me, Poe left it open-ended at the end to have a sequel.
Yeah.
Because And that's one of the things that we were talking about. It was like King Pest's legs tossed him into the open trap door and slammed it shut on him. So basically threw him in a hole in solitary confinement at the very end when he was trying to save Hugh. And then he like takes care of all the rest. The coffin guy is floating off because they had dumped all the wine out or whatever they were drinking. And then what really made it interesting is as Legs and Hugh are running out, Legs has grabbed the Duchess of Pest.
Yes.
And is carrying her out the door, and they take off with him. So I'm like, oh, look, so it's Annabelle Lee they left with. So they took off, and I'm like, oh, I wonder if they're taking her back to the sea because they are seamen. I was like, okay,
True.
like, why out of everybody they took off with the Duchess of Pest? But okay. So
I wondered if a couple of things. One, Poe is, and y'all are the experts, not me, but where does 1835 fall in Poe's career? Is that the middle, the beginning? Where are we?
Let's see.
More past. I mean, it's past his military and West Point days, and it's. I think wasn't he back in Baltimore by this time?
Let me look it up real quick because off the top of my head, I can't remember.
Okay. Okay.
Hold on.
So Dr. Thompson, he's at least down to the last like 15 years of his life. Anyway. Okay. Yeah. So okay. So that kind of tells me generally what I needed to know, which is that it may be that Poe, I mean, the presidency at the time did not have term limits, right? Like a term was 4 years, but you could go indefinitely, right? Which is exactly what Roosevelt does. So, maybe Poe left it open-ended, thinking like the guy's presidency is not over yet, So he's always, every good TV script writer, right? Like there's always like this, even if it's the end of the series, there's still some little hook that they could build on if they had to, if demand calls for it, there's always a little hook down there somewhere that you could build on if you had to. And so I mean, is it possible that Poe is leaving himself open if this is going to become a series one day, if Jackson is going to give us so much to work with, as writers, and if Jackson is going to give us so much material to work with, then, why close it off? Why not just leave in one little hook that he could use to build things up again? I would have loved to have seen Poe take up this subject again in 1837. Jackson's out of office, Van Buren is in, but that's when all of the economic fallout of the bank it just kind of comes crashing down on the nation. And to the best of my knowledge, Jackson never once, in deciding whether or not he's going to sign off on the bank charter or whether he's going to veto it, he never once has a conversation with himself that I know of, or with any economists or financiers to say, if the bank collapses like this, if I refuse to renew the charter, what happens to the bank? Okay, I want to put the money in state banks or pet banks, which gives Jackson an executive branch a tremendous amount of power. What if I do that? Like, what are the financial implications? Like, how are the practicalities of that system going to be felt across the nation? Jackson never does that. And then all of a sudden here, you can't just yank all the government's money out of the bank in one go and scatter it to the winds. What do you think is going to happen? Right. And so, and it's exactly what does happen, which is that we're in a profound depression very, very quickly, which of course Van Buren, bears all the weight for.
All out.
So it's very unfair to Van Buren that, although Van Buren was kind of Jackson's yes man, so I mean he gets a share of it, but but he never even talks to them. There's a story that a coworker of mine likes to tell, which is when a group of New York bankers comes to the White House for an audience with Jackson, and they ask, they ask for a bit of his time. It's Jackson, it's Van Buren, it's these New York financiers, and they sit down and they get about 3 sentences out of their mouth, And Jackson just lights them up, kind of tearing up one side of them and back down the other, over constitutional standards, right, and constitutionality. And they eventually are just so browbeaten by Jackson's demeanor that they sort of slink out of the office, saying, "I'm sorry, Mr. President. We'll never bother you again, Mr. President. Forgive us for wasting your time, Mr. President." And then as soon as they leave, Jackson turns to Van Buren and says, "I handled that really well, didn't I?" It's Jackson doesn't even want to have the discussion. He's not even going to have the discussion of what's going to happen.
Yeah, and he fits very well, especially in that time period and everything that's gone through. I think part of his uppityness, we'll call it, at that point, is because he has been so successful in his military career, and he's used to calling the shots, basically. Because, I mean, think of it. He's like the only president since Washington, I think, was president that had any military experience that got elected. Am I wrong? I can't remember because
James Monroe did.
Right.
He did. He was sort of Washington's right-hand man at the Battle of Trenton. But Monroe was very young during the Revolution. He was not, but he had already an established relationship with Washington and was kind of Washington's right-hand man.
I guess I was thinking more on the upper echelon, how Washington was a general and then Jackson was a colonel. I was talking that level. I'm not as actual military because Monroe, he was young and he was enlisted and was helpful with Washington. So
you're right. All the rest of Jackson's predecessors are, with the exception of Washington and Monroe's teenage, early adulthood service, but they're all engaged in diplomatic efforts. Jefferson and Adams and Quincy Adams, they're all diplomats, or they're prosecuting the war through legal channels, and so they're not battlefield soldiers. I think for Jackson, though, even more than the generalship, which just kind of speaks to his overall demeanor, is the fact that Jackson is reelected by one of the largest margins in history. Like it's a landslide. I mean, he just mops the floor with Adams in the 28 election, but then with Clay in the 32 election, where he is, he's fighting the bank, he's fighting nullification, Indian removal is being enacted, and people are all up in arms about how that's going, and Jackson still wins by one of the largest margins in history. And that's a mandate. That's when you use the word mandate, right? That, clearly the people want Jackson to do, clearly they approve of what Jackson is doing, right?
Yes.
And so Jackson just, okay, this is what the people want me to do. So doesn't matter if you're a New York financier who's trying to tell me to stop because all this is, all of our economy is going to go south. It doesn't matter. The people have said they want me to do this. So this is what happens. This is what we'll do. I think the only people who are reelected with a higher margin than Jackson, of course, Washington never counts, but we never count Washington. But Lyndon Johnson, and James Monroe are the two that are elected with the highest. I think they're the only two higher than Jackson in their election margins.
Yeah. Okay. And then you also have to take in consideration in the early parts where the electoral college was more prominent in some areas than the popular, because they kind of went hand in hand more than later years, where it's like, okay, as we grew as a nation and the electoral college came more into play rather than more popular vote, it kind of got a little more skewed in that area, because that was one of the things with the Jackson and the corrupt bargain, is what happened with that was because it was like, okay, wait a minute, Henry Clay and who was the other one?
John Quincy
Adams. Yeah. JQ, the son,
I've just started calling him Quincy. It makes it much easier.
Quincy. Okay. I would always go with the kids. I just call him John Q because it was like, he's the Q man.
Well, I looked up in 1835, Poe had moved back to Richmond because he was the editor of the Southern Literary Messenger after he won the Saturday Visitor Award for message or MS Found in a Bottle. And so
Okay.
I was about to say that, but
thank you.
To it.
Yeah.
Our minds.
Yes. Well, what are
Awesome.
some other thoughts on this story? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Like what? I'm anxious
Is
to
it
hear.
wrong that I laughed a lot?
No, because it's satire. This was total satire on Poe's part.
It's a wild, rollicking story.
Yes.
I will admit the very first time I read this, I think I was maybe right out of high school, maybe going into my first year of college.
Yeah.
And I was like,
Yeah.
Not my favorite, but read it again for this. And I kept laughing. I'm like, what was I reading a long time ago? Because I don't remember like 3/4 of it. And I was just like, I just kept laughing. I really quite enjoyed the descriptions of the various pests.
Yes.
They were quite colorful. you get a good image.
I really liked that his descriptions, like I think Jeannie mentioned earlier that how much extra he put into it, but he described everybody before he gave them their names. And it was just very interesting that he didn't say, this is King Pest or describe. And that was the, King Pest. He didn't say the names. It was like a list after he described everybody. And that's just very different. It's like it's like he wanted to make them out to be as grotesque as they possibly could. And then let me just add their names all are Pest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of took it as like silly horror, kind of like the Evil Dead before the Evil Dead. To me,
yeah.
I enjoyed like this.
That's a good
kind of like this silly, but the descriptions were great.
Yes, Micah.
Sorry.
Yes.
You see Micah's comment?
That's awesome.
Yes, Micah, that is spot on.
Spot on.
Nice.
Yeah, the Mad Tea Party.
The first time I ever read this was I was reading a few stories. Like I just decided to sit down one day and just read some stories. And I think I read this one after I wrote. I'm reading at the same time. I read How to Write a Blackwood Article, which is also a great story. And eventually we'll read that one if you haven't read it. And I think, let me make sure Psyche Zenobia is the main character in it. And kind of like what we were talking about with it, like Jeannie said, it seems like it's open for a sequel. Poe did use her character in another story after How to Write a Blackwood article. And she's got a lot of charisma and just a great character. And I'm trying to remember which story it was.
I just went blank because you said it and I was like,
yeah.
And it was gone.
And just a little, if you like James Bond, there is a Dr. Moneypenny in How to Write a Blackwood article.
Nice.
Throwing that in there. I'll remember what it is, and it doesn't really like necessary. I think it may be a predicament. Virginia, is that it?
I think, hold on. Let me shoot.
But anyway,
that's gonna drive me nuts.
Yeah, while we're thinking, what other thoughts you guys had?
Well, Will said he hated that he left it open-ended, which I agree.
Yeah.
Because out of all the other stories that I think of Poe, there's not any that I've had up until that point not been, happy with it being concluded.
Yeah.
Being left without some type of closure. Where with this one, it's like I was still, as I was reading it when they were leaving and they were carrying the Duchess of N and Pest, and I'm waiting, and all of a sudden it ends, and I literally was checking to make sure that that was the ending.
Yeah.
I was making sure that my phone hadn't downloaded some, it stopped downloading, or I was on the one of the websites, and I was like, it was the Poe Museum website, I think it was, and I was like, did they not upload the whole story? Am I missing something? But
Yeah.
no, that was the ending, and I'm going, well, that bastard. Like, are you kidding me? You dumped King Pest in a hole. You flooded everybody else out. You destroyed
Well,
all them. You got poor Duchess Anna Pest being kidnapped by this crazy person and his little sidekick. Which, by the way, let's talk about those two particular characters very quickly. The description that Poe makes of
of what? Of who?
Legs.
Oh yeah,
legs.
Legs. The tall guy that pretty much is like a walking skeleton.
Yes.
And then you got the little short guy who is the sidekick of Hugh, who he even makes a description that he's not even 4 feet tall.
Yeah.
I mean, did I not? I'm like, but then every time it's like the worthy Hugh, and then it's like I think at one point he even said gallant legs, which I thought was ironic because I'm like, really? Because I kept thinking Legs is a giraffe, and then you got little Hugh running beside him as a sidekick. Because I'm like, oh, I'm going to think of Madagascar right now. You know how you have the really tall giraffe who's the hypochondriac. That's kind of what I'm looking at with Legs. And then you got the little bitty koala bear looking thing who is, King Julian's right hand person.
Yeah.
And is always getting in trouble. And that brings me up to where it all went haywire is when the little guy starts laughing at King Pest, just kept laughing at him and saying, oh, he was more on the side. He says, nah, I'm not going to see that one. I'll be meeting the devil and be having a party kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, I mean, anybody else get kind of a weird description when he was describing Legs and Hugh going, this is really strange.
Well, and it does remind me of a lot of the, Disney movies where you have the two little sidekick for comic relief kind of thing. One article I looked at compared Legs with the elongated face and the bulging eyes to John C. Calhoun. And so, which I thought was weird because he wasn't one of the pests. And if, which it would have made more sense if he was for being vice president.
Yeah, but by 1835, Calhoun is not vice president.
No.
True. That's true. That's true.
So the character that he described as having like the jaws that kind of rested like bladders that rest on his cheek, that made me think of Van Buren more.
Okay.
Calhoun, at Jackson's death, he says that he only had 2 regrets in life. One is that he doesn't shoot John C. Calhoun, and the other is that he didn't hang Henry Clay, mostly because of Calhoun's machinations in South Carolina.
Yeah.
So it did make me think of Calhoun, but mostly what it really made me think of was Laurel and Hardy.
Yes.
So you had Laurel and Hardy, right? Where you had like the big guy and then like the tall, skinny guy who's kind of like stupid and never talks and is always, Laurel's always, am I getting this right? Hardy's always having to tell Laurel what to do, because it's like he can't figure it out for himself, but you can't fault Laurel for his faithfulness to his friend or his willingness to like fight the good fight or his willingness to, support his buddy, even when his buddy's kind of mean and picks on him. So the scene when they decide to flee the tavern without paying for their ale, I love the humming stuff. I love that term for it. But, they refuse to pay for it, or they decide they're going to slip without paying. But it takes Hugh, a couple of times to even find the door, because he says he keeps running into the fireplace and like hitting the back wall. And then it takes him a few times of doing this before he can then kind kind of get himself going the right direction, so almost that sort of slapstick physical comedy angle of it was I thought really interesting.
Yeah, it fit very well, because I was like, he's starting it off as kind of a slapstick humor satire, because I was getting like you said, the Laurel and Hardy vibes, just thinking of the two opposite ends, I guess is what I was thinking, with legs being as tall and lanky, and you have the one extreme with the tall lankiness, and then you have the very next extreme with the very short and stodgy looking.
Right.
So it's like he was covering both ends of a spectrum type of thing.
Yeah.
So it started out weird, and then they knew, and what was so funny is they knew they didn't have any money to pay for their ale at the tavern, but they were drinking it anyway. But and they tried to run away, and like I said, it was a bar and leave instead of a door dash or a dine and dash kind of. Yeah. So, but yeah, it was, and then poor Hugh, he couldn't, it was like, he's one of those you can think when you lay the comment down of they couldn't find their way out of a paper bag. They were that idiotic.
Yeah.
Poe, that was the description I got the most from Hugh. That, but
one other thing I was going to add too, now Poe did adapt this story, like he edited it multiple times. And the original with 1835, he has the quote right after the title, King Pest the First, a tale containing an allegory. And then he's got a quote, the gods do bear and well allow in kings the things which they abhor in rascal routs. And this is from Buckhurst's Tragedy of Ferrex and Porrex. And Ferrex and Porrex, this is from a Renaissance play where these two characters were sailors at the time of Edward III's reign. And so I think there's that tie-in of the allegory to Tarpaulin and Legs.
Yeah.
And with George III being Andrew Jackson.
Is there again, y'all are the Poe experts, but is there I did try to find sort of the smoking gun where I could see Poe saying, oh yeah, guys, I'm writing this allegory and it's about Andrew Jackson, right? I was trying to find like the smoking gun just to link all this together. I didn't find one. Are y'all familiar with something in that way?
No. And I looked at several different articles. I didn't necessarily read every single one, but I spot checked different things to find different pieces. The Ferrex and Porrex kind of connection was prevalent in many articles that I looked at. But one article, and I don't really want to go down this rabbit hole, and Jeanie and I talked about it, and it was somebody that while Trump was president compared, because of Trump saying that, he was like Andrew Jackson, comparing Trump to Jackson to King Pest. Like they were all like this triangle of, and I thought that was really, really interesting. And again, I didn't even finish reading the article because I was like, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole.
Right. And it did feel like a rabbit hole. And there were a couple of, even with the, even talking about Ferrex and Porrex, the Ferrex and Porrex is about Edward III dividing his kingdom between his two sons. And he said, the author of that article said, as if it should be evident to everybody, well, obviously Jackson had the same problem. Like somehow Jackson was trying to like divide power, divide the country, it seemed like quite a take on the connection that just didn't hold up. So if he was trying
it was loose. It was like a few elements compared, like in the appropriate way. And then it kind of got like convoluted. It was like a little bitty, little bitty spider web hanging there. So.
Yeah. Well, the one thing about Poe and the writings and the supposition that he is attributing certain characters to certain real life people, I don't think he's ever like when he hates transcendentalists, but I don't think he ever actually came out and used particular names in his stories for the transcendentalists. I mean, he alluded to them a lot, and you could make that connection. So, but it was like he lets his opinion be known, but it's because here's where it comes to me. It's like the Law and Order. When you begin the Law and Order thing, it says the names have been changed to protect. That's kind of the way I feel when I read Poe. It's like the names have been changed, and so to protect the real people he's writing about. But in essence, the way he has his description set up, I think he is saying it, but he's not owning up to it in real life, I guess.
Right.
So, but one thing is I think that we could tear this story to pieces a lot, especially between the historical aspects of the Jacksonian democracy and Poe and his real life, because I talked to Carmen earlier saying that, even though Poe originally was poor, when Alan received his inheritance and he became one of the upper echelons and he was seen as being an affluent person, I can see him not being a proponent of Jackson at all, based on the spoil system and everything, and about how the affluence of the day did not like how Jackson was affecting their world. So I think that might have been another instance of where he may have been on the side of not a Jackson supporter kind of thing. So, but
all right. Well, did we like this? Did we?
I liked it.
It was okay. Like I said before, it wasn't my favorite.
Yeah, me neither.
But I do agree the descriptions of the pests were amusing.
Yeah.
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 Definitely.
I like it definitely for satire. It's not one of my favorites, but in many of the articles that I looked at about it after I reread it today was it's one that no one hardly ever reads. And so it's good to keep some of those things present, within the realm of what Poe wrote. Because it's beautiful satire when you just get right down to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In my opinion, he shows a lot more.
Mike is taking a jab at you, Jeanie.
I know.
Guess what Guess what I had her, Jeanie. Guess what she had to do on the Thanksgiving episode? She had to read a quote from the Mummy story.
Yes, she tortured me with it.
I offered to read it, and she goes, "No, it'll be better at the end." And I'm always the end quote.
Exactly. So
poor Jeanie.
I sucked it up and I did it, but I didn't like it. But actually, Mike, I was actually going to say that as far as this story goes, I liked it a heck of a lot better than I did with Some Words with a Mummy, because I still want to take Some Words with a Mummy and have a nice bonfire.
Yeah, Erin, she hated that story, and we still give her a hard time about it.
Yeah,
as often as we can.
Yes,
as often as we can. We love you, Jeanie.
Yes.
That's okay.
Well,
that's awesome.
So we had kind of said, what we were reading up through this month, but you guys don't know what we're going to be reading next month and a little bit later than that. So in December, one of our Gothic guests, we're starting to get lots of Gothic guests, and we're so excited to be doing all these interviews with different people. But one of them is going to be, and Jeff knows him, Mark DeWidziak. I know this is backwards, but he wrote The Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. So Mark is going to be joining us in December on Poe Unplugged. We're also going to be doing an interview with him very soon. But he wanted to read The Cask of Amontillado. So that's what is on December's reading list. And and he also, because there's several things that he likes, and he does acting himself, he is going to do a special recitation of something for us, and I'm not going to tell you what it is because it's going to be amazing. So that's going to be like our little finale for December's Poe Unplugged.
Sounds great.
Widziak is very, very talented and brilliant. And his new book that you just held up is outstanding.
Yeah, I'm reading it right now. Yeah, it's great. His writing is beautiful. So, and then in January, we're going to be doing Murders in the Rue Morgue.
Oh, good.
And so we're working on somebody possibly coming on for that Poe Unplugged. I haven't gotten confirmation yet, so I don't want to say whether or not he's going to be joining us. So we haven't totally decided what we're doing February and beyond. But again, if you guys, we had already opened that up. If you guys have suggestions or want to lead a Poe Unplugged, just let us know, because we're open to it. And you guys are awesome and are always with us, and we just want you to do the Poe things.
And we especially want to thank Erin for joining us, because we truly enjoyed our discussion with her.
You added so much. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Linda, thank you for joining us also. She is one of the Jackson's Library regulars on their book club. So check out, I was going to say, if you go to the Hermitage Jackson's Library card, you can see their book club as well. You do, Erin,
it's the first Tuesday night of the month. Okay. We start at 7. We just do it via Microsoft Teams. So, and it's discussion. So just very similar format. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. December's book is The Cotton Kingdom. It was written by Frederick Law Olmsted. It's one of his earlier works where he is traveling through the South, talking about cotton economy, slavery. So that's December's. And then January's is Joshua Rothman's book, Reforming America. So talking about just the zeal for reform efforts and so forth. We've done Poe. So if you're not familiar with our book club, we do a variety of period works, as well as secondary works. We've done poetry, we do short stories, we do novels, we do historical works. So we just do a little bit of everything. One thing that we're going to try this year is doing these little mini arcs where we do say 3 books in a row, kind of on the same subject, or on a related theme, and then jump to something else. So, but yeah, cool. You're welcome to join anytime, please.
Yeah, cool. And I've been on it, and it's been great. It's been really it's a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
Well, I am super excited to get to know your Poe book club, so I'll have to be back.
Yeah, definitely. And anybody on your book club wants to come on, just tell them about it and have them join.
Cool.
All right. Anybody else have anything? I think, Jeff, did you want to?
Yeah. What is the date for December? Is it 19 or 26?
Yes, it's going to be December 19th. I was afraid to move it to the 26th because of, that was just even though it's the day after Christmas, I just felt like people are going to be possibly traveling and that kind of thing. Murders in the Rue Morgue will be January 30th, the last Tuesday, just like the normal, Thanksgiving and Christmas. I just wanted to make sure we weren't hitting too many people's, family plans and things. So.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. This was so much fun.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Good to see everybody. Jeff and everybody. Yeah.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.